conference, I'd like to take probably about 20 or so minutes to go over the highlights of the 3 days of the conference. So this is a quick summation. If you wanted to ask questions as well, I can answer some of those at the end of our time. But let's begin with a word of prayer. Holy God and gracious God, we give you thanks for this time to share, to learn, to grow as a people, a connectional people, to understand what we as a denomination in our whole region, a conference, are doing together to grow the kingdom of God here on earth. In your holy name we pray. Amen. So, annual conference. How many of you have ever actually been to an annual conference? All right, I got the two here. Okay, all right, that's good. Then you may, this is something new perhaps, for you to know what all goes on at a conference. I like to think of annual conference in terms of celebrating as a community, as a connection. And the first piece of the celebration that I'll bring up is at annual conference. The last part of annual conference is the service of commissioning new provisional elders and deacons and the ordination of full elders and deacons in the church. That is the culmination of annual conference. For me, that is the greatest 2-hour worship experience of the year. I put that on top of everything else I do and see in church. And, plug for YouTube, if you ever want to watch one of those worship services from annual conference, they're on YouTube. So you can see what it's like to be at an annual conference in worship. This year, the celebration was 9 full elders were ordained in the church, 2 full deacons were ordained, 3 of our candidates were commissioned as provisional elders, and 2 candidates were commissioned as provisional deacons. Also this year, there was a group of 5 folks who completed a certification program for the certified lay ministry work of the church. That is a way for folks in local churches to step up as either worship leaders or fill-in preachers, or in some cases, they actually take on their own churches as certified lay ministers. So 5 of those folks were also certified at our annual conference this year, another celebration. One of those is actually the pastor in Flintstone, who received and completed her work as a certified lay minister this year. So there are some local folks who come through these programs that we celebrate. We also celebrated during the whole conference a former member of this conference who is now a bishop, the bishop Cynthia Moore Kokoi, and she was the bishop who offered the message, or the sermon, during the service of ordination and commissioning. She grew up in Baltimore, was a district superintendent here in this conference before we as a conference affirmed her to become eligible to be a bishop. And that was only about 8 years ago, I think, that we confirmed her for that work as a bishop. So she was back joining us this year, which was a joy because many people in this conference know her well. So it was a kind of a homecoming for her. On top of that, the benefit for her was her husband was ordained here this year, and so she got to actually be part of the ordination of her own husband. Probably a nice thing, right? So that's the kind of celebration that we had going on at conference. Conference also takes its time for lament as well. We recognize what happened in the past year for folks who have passed on from this life to eternity. All the clergy in the last 12 months who passed away get recognized. 21 clergy were so honored at our service of remembrance. Also, the spouses of clergy get recognized and honored as well. The 14 of them were also honored this conference. And children of clergy, unfortunately, we also recognize who passed on. So that service took place the second day of annual conference, part of our lament that we do. We also lament church closures, and this year there were 6 churches that we recognized as closing in the annual conference, one of which is Mount Tabor Church in Old Town. So one of the local churches here was recognized in that. But in addition to then the worship, the prayers, the celebration, and the lament, there is the business. and the business of the church. This year was unusual because we had to work on 4 amendments to the general constitution of the church. That I've never experienced an annual conference where we had to actually vote on the amendments to the constitution of the church. So this doesn't happen every year. And in fact, we got very confused about how we were supposed to do it when we started because we were doing it wrong at first. Because it is so unusual, we had to actually stop ourselves and have those who were in charge of figuring out who is and who is not eligible to vote to get their heads together and to then say in the afternoon, okay, who's allowed to vote and who's not? Let's figure it out. Because there's an interesting detail of all the people who are attending annual conference and in general have a right to vote. Every one of the lay members to the conference gets to vote on constitutional amendments. But only the clergy who are ordained get to do that. So the provisional elders would not be able to do that. All the licensed local pastors who would be able to vote on other things are not allowed to vote on a constitutional amendment in the church. And that's where we were stumbling in the morning of that session because we forgot, and that had to be corrected. So some details there that had to get worked out at the conference. But there were 4 amendments that had been brought out. Now, all 4 of those amendments were voted approval. They were voted for the approval at last year's general conference. But for them to actually go into effect, they have to be voted on by all of the annual conferences around the world. And a 2/3 majority vote of every voting person of every annual conference has to then approve an amendment to our Constitution. And so with this vote, it was also unusual for us because normally when we take a vote at annual conference, we find out the results right then and there. Because every annual conference has to vote on these, the results were held secret because they have to wait until every annual conference votes so that they don't accidentally cause some other annual conference to skew their vote if they find out how other conferences are voting along the way. We are one of the earliest of the conferences to have a vote, and so our vote, though taken, is unknown to any of us who were in attendance, except for the bishop and the secretary of the conference. And the rest of us do not know what the results were. We will find that out when the Council of Bishops meet in October, and then they will formally announce what the votes were in November. So what I tell you about these amendments, we have no clue whether they fully pass until probably the end of this year. So there were 4 amendments, as I said. The first of the amendments is probably the biggest one, and it involves the reorganization of the church into regions. This was approved at the General Conference last year, and the idea has been that for many years, the United Methodist Church has operated where there are all the countries outside of the United States are all put into what they call central conferences. And those central conferences are allowed to make some of their own worship decisions as a region or a central group. They can make some changes to the book of discipline specific only to them, but not the rest of the world. And this work of regionalization was meant to include United States into that same pool of the central conferences. In other words, if this passes, the United States will start being able to make its own hymnal and not have to go all the way to a general conference to create a new hymnal. It would allow the United States to create its own worship materials without having to have them go to a general conference to be approved. It will allow the United States to make some other local decisions about ways ministry is handled or way we operate as a church in certain aspects of the church that don't require everybody around the world to do this. And like I said, this is something that other parts of the world are already granted, but we in the United States have to take anything we want to the full general conference. If this approves, we're allowed to make some of those similar decision-making actions within the United States rather than having to go to the full general conference. So that was the first one, the regionalization plan. The second of the amendments, and I've got my books here because I'm going to forget them if I open up my books. The second of the amendments had to do with our inclusive language statement in our book of discipline. We have a number of places actually, statements on the inclusivity of the church, including how we believe all persons may be part of the United Methodist Church, to be baptized and received into community. And in the past, there's been a list of about 6 different groups or categories of people in our list of inclusiveness. This year, the constitutional amendment was to add 2 more of those groups. One of those is a pretty sad oversight, which is gender, has not been listed in our inclusion statement, so that was one of the things to add into our inclusion statement. The other one was ability, to go along with race, color, national origin, status, economic condition. It will now include, if it passes, gender and ability as those group categories that we specifically name to be inclusive into the church. The third item that came up as an amendment was to make a revision to what our statement on racial justice is. In our constitutional bylaws of the church, we have a paragraph on racial justice in the United Methodist Church. This revision would add language to what is currently in that, and it's an extensive change. I could not read the whole thing here, but I can make available for anyone who would want to read it what has been proposed. If it is passed, again, we will find out in November whether this statement is expanded from what we currently have in the Book of Discipline. The fourth item of a constitutional amendment gets really deep into the weeds. This is one about what are the exact criteria that a licensed local pastor must have in order to be eligible to be named to a general conference or jurisdictional conference as a delegate. Oh, it's in the weeds of bureaucracy. This is a fun one. The language was to add a statement that a licensed local pastor must either have completed the course of study materials or must have a Master of Divinity degree from a university Senate-approved theological school. That phrase is what's missing currently. So the addition would be that they want it to be a university Senate-approved theological school. Little details. We'll see what, again, the votes have started. They've started to accumulate those. The answer we'll find out later this year. More of the business of the church, though, are other recommendations. At annual conference, they set what the financial picture of the whole conference looks like. They set a budget. This year's budget for our annual conference is actually going to be projected lower than the current year's budget, coming down by almost $200,000 from the current budget. So the conference is aware of financial pressures on churches and is trying to make some changes in how much our mission shares are going to be paying into the conference, to the tune that next year that number is actually dropping by $200,000 to $240,000 from what it is this year. That total budget, in case you're interested in the conference, is $18.2 million is the budget for the conference. $11.9 million of that comes from the mission share apportionments from the churches. So close to 2/3, maybe not quite, but well over half of that budget of the annual conference comes from apportionments, but $9 million comes from something else, other things. So a fair portion comes from other funding sources. It was also brought up at the conference about budgets that the conference is going to lower what they call the benevolence factor that churches use to determine what that mission share amount is. Currently, the benevolence factor is 17.4%. It's going to drop to 17.25%. That'll save us a few dollars, is what it boils down to. Not a lot, but it'll save us a few dollars. I remember back when that benevolence factor was well over 18%. So they have been working as a conference to lower those factors over the years and are still trying to do that as much as possible. Also at this conference, we learned about the plans for the housing allowance changes for pastors for next year. That will increase by about $670 to try to keep up with general cost of living changes. There's also every year an adjustment to what the minimal salary is for clergy. That also rises. It's level near cost of living adjustment, just for your awareness. And they also included, we had a long discussion about what is the proper reimbursement account value for clergy. And that was one of the most contentious sessions of the conference. What they decided to go with is the current number that we use for clergy's reimbursement is $4,100 across the whole conference. That number has not changed in more than a decade. And even though most churches don't have a problem with clergy exceeding that, there are some parts of our conference where that is very much too low for them to keep all the things that some of the clergy are doing and to reimburse them properly at that amount. So they've now proposed to change that from a fixed number of $4,100 to a 10% of the pastor's salary should be the considered value for a reimbursement account. We'll see how that rolls out this summer when we start looking at those conference forms, but that was also approved at this conference. The other 8 items of the conference that were voted on, resolutions, range across a number of topics. We approved as conference what one church had created. They called an African American Creed that we approved for use in general, that if churches wish to use what was proposed by one church as an extra statement of faith in their worship time, that was acceptable to the conference as a whole. It was a little, again, a very strange conversation took place because the resolution was so poorly written that we spent probably 20 minutes just trying to figure out what the real intent was, let alone pursuing what the answer was. It's a beautifully written statement of faith, but we were awfully confused about what was meant by the whole resolution, and it wasted a whole lot of time for them simply to say, our conference will allow anybody who wants to use this to use this. Okay, so we will. Another thing that came up was to revisit, again, technical details, how sometimes multiple actions by the annual conference can get lumped together into a single vote if they don't deal with finances, if they don't cost any money, if they're not going to be controversial. They can lump together a whole bunch of actions under something they call a consent calendar vote. And what they had in this conference is a revision of the way they describe how those consent calendars need to be advertised and shared, and for people to understand how to actually make changes to that. Again, some of this gets into the details of how we operate at annual conference. Another resolution approved was to have a set statement of equity in the vacation offered to clergy, to appointed clergy. As our rules currently are in the Baltimore-Washington Conference, there was a very big difference between how part-time clergy and full-time clergy were being dealt with in their vacation allotments. And so this was to standardize that even if a clergy person is part-time, they should still be allowed to step down from the pulpit 4 times a year. And that was the idea here. So as to even out whether or not a person was full-time or part-time on vacation. The conference voted in favor of a complete rewrite of our parental leave policy for clergy. There have been little modifications over the years about what our conference-wide policy should be for parental leave. Now that has all been standardized and put together into a new package so that everyone can know what is the expectations on clergy, on district superintendents, and on local churches, so that proper parental leave is given, not only for parents of their biological children, but for adoption and for foster care parenting, to have an inclusion in this policy for parental leave, noting the importance in all of those to gather as family. Let's see here. That was a long policy. I got to skip a bunch of pages. La-di-da-di-da-di-da-di. And then we get into some of our social principles resolutions. And often at a conference, there are 2, 3, maybe 4 social principle-based resolutions. One was to encourage churches to have conversations about artificial intelligence, because many people don't know about it, many people are afraid of it, many people don't realize how much we're already using it, and many people don't know what that means to be a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ if some computer is spitting out information at you all the time. And so there was an invitation really approved that if churches would start learning about ways to discuss artificial intelligence and what that means to church, and what does that mean to us as disciples of Jesus Christ. And there was encouragement for the people who put that proposal together to actually help find resources, so some of us who have no idea what we're thinking about or talking about can go and find some resources to share. We had another proposal to call on peace and justice for the people of Sudan, for the war that has been going on there for a decade and more, to seek to have our general boards of ministry around the world call for peace and for justice in the people in Sudan. We also had an approval of a proposed resolution to address and respond to dangers of religious nationalism around the world, both locally and internationally. And in all countries of the world, there seems to be a rise right now of extremist religious nationalisms. And part of this is to make more people aware of how this is going on around the world and ways in which we should hold ourselves from falling into patterns of religious nationalism ourselves. And I think the last of the resolutions was to encourage local churches and our boards of the Baltimore-Washington Conference to have a better ability to speak with lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans folks in our communities, in the churches themselves, and in how we work in our neighborhoods, to be better mindful and better careful in the way that we are ministering for folks' lives. Those are the biggies. Those were all the resolutions this year. Those are the details about the amendments to the Constitution that we talked about at annual conference, the celebrations and the laments and the prayers. So thank you for staying, and if you have questions, I'm happy to take questions. It's a good question. So regionalization, is it just the United States, or is it other parts of the country or other parts of the world lumped together, i.e., are we with Canada or not? Might be another way of thinking about that. I have seen conflicting answers. I don't have a perfect answer on that one. I believe for it to make sense, we should be including Canada in that, because otherwise Canada has to be its own region. And it's a very small number of churches in Canada, but there are churches, United Methodist churches in Canada. I can't remember if we are including Canada in our region. I think we are, but I'd have to go back and look. It should be, otherwise Canada being having a very small footprint of United Methodist churches would be its own region, which that makes no sense. So I hope that's how they've decided. Any other questions? Great. Thank you for your time, for your attention. Happy to share it.